haere mai, ki tēnei wānanga. That's welcome everybody to this particular webinar. I'm Melanie Ruffell from the Riddet Institute, and many of you already know, I see we have some familiar faces joining us today. We run a series of webinars supported by the High Value Nutrition Science Challenge program, and this is brought to you by the Riddet Institute together with our resident experts here, Peter Brown and Michelle Cubitt. So given that we are running these webinars fairly regularly, please do keep an eye on our website or the HVN website and both of those LinkedIn pages, and you'll have news of the next round of webinars that we'll be running. But today is a really interesting day. We're going to be focusing this session on innovation in dairy, milk alternatives and hybrid milks, so a very topical issue. And Peter will give a quick run through of the recent patent landscape of dairy innovation, looking at both conventional dairy products and health benefits, as well as the latest updates in the sort of alternative dairy products we're starting to see emerge now. And then Michelle will review the market and regulatory trends happening in this particular space so far in 2022, and have a look at how some of the earlier predictions are working out and what to look for in the rest of the year that's coming. So very quickly, a little bit about our experts. Dr. Peter Brown will speak first. He is principal at Spruson and Ferguson, and he provides strategic and thankfully fairly easy to understand patent analytic reports to clients, and that's including within the HVN community. So we're very grateful to have Peter here because his valuable insights and knowledge helps actually navigate us through this challenging area to understand and bringing together the science and commercialization goals of R&D programs. And then Michelle Cubitt is a regulatory consultant at Smart Regulatory Solutions, and we're equally lucky to have her. She has a huge wealth of experience in cosmetic, natural food, health and pharmaceutical industries, and she provides strategic advice also to help navigate the complexities of the regulatory world, and that also can help enable successful product commercialization and export across the world in a very simple and, well, as simple as regs can be, smart way. So just before I hand over to Peter, just a reminder, the way our webinars roll is that please feel free to submit questions through the chat function as they come to mind. As you will have heard, the session is being recorded, so we share this recording via the HVN website in due course, and Peter and Michelle's emails will be shown at the end. And do feel free to also speak at the end of the two presentations if you'd rather talk to your questions rather than submitting them through the chat function. So with that said, I will hand over now to Peter Brown, and take it away, Peter. Thank you.
Kia ora, everyone. Great to see everyone again. Even though there's a lot of black screens, it's good to catch up with everyone just before the presentation. So I'm just sharing my screen now, so hopefully it should come through in 2 seconds. Hopefully that's all right there now.
That's good.
Great. Okay, so yes, so this is just a brief snapshot of the dairy landscape, as Melanie mentioned. This is actually taken from a report that I've just completed, and it should be available on the HVN website in the knowledge section, hopefully in the coming few weeks once it's finalized. And it is, there we go. So what we're going to be covering today, like Melanie said, so we're going to be mainly looking at like since 2018, the insights from the patent landscape from conventional dairy milk, as well as alternative milks that can be either plant-based or cell-based, and also milk hybrids. And I think what we're talking about there is mainly dairy milk mixed with other forms or alternative milks, essentially. And we're seeing some of that stuff come through in the market now. So what we're going to be looking at primarily is focusing on a comparison between what's happening in China, because there's a lot happening there, and comparing that to other countries in the dairy landscape. We're going to be looking at the plant-based trends, particularly looking at some examples of milk hybrids, and looking at what the startups are doing in this space, and particularly what a lot of the startups are looking at is fermentation technology. And then finally, profiling a few of the multinationals and what they're doing in the dairy space as well. So this first one here is a great slide just because it basically, a picture paints 1,000 words here. The dark blue line is showing the number of Chinese patent filings since 2018 in the dairy space. So we use specific ways of searching, narrowing it down to the patents that are related to the dairy space. And it's just mind-boggling to see the dominance in the number of patent filings that China is producing here. This actually does include some filings of other countries that have filed into China, but the large majority of them, I think it's something like 90–95%, are actually from Chinese applicants here. So I think that's just really interesting to look at what China is very focused on this space. It's you have to be a bit careful in looking too much at this, but essentially a lot of these patents are very kind of minimal in terms of the data in them. But what we've actually done, even though this is the raw data, you can filter down to the patents that are still highly relevant and have got strong scientific support behind them, and there's still a lot of them there. So if we exclude China from the data set, you can actually see how the other countries are relatively contributing to the patent landscape. And what we can see here is that the main countries, the four main kind of top filers are Japan, South Korea, Russia, and the United States. So I think over the last kind of few years, in terms of what they're contributing to the landscape, you can kind of say, well, these are potential countries that we could explore for commercial opportunities, collaborations, and so forth, as well as you have to consider this from an FTO, or freedom to operate perspective. I think probably the exception here is perhaps might not want to be commercializing in Russia or collaborating in Russia in particular at this time, but it's certainly interesting to see what's happening in these territories. So when we can actually filter down to which companies, I should say, are contributing to the patent landscape, and I've divided it between what's happening in China versus what's happening outside of China to give us a bit of insight here. What we can see is that Yili Group and Bright Dairy Co. are the biggest filers inside China by far, whereas outside China, it's Arla Foods and Nestle, and followed up with some universities and so forth that are contributing to that landscape. Even though it's not shown here, Fonterra actually contributed, I think it was 16 patent applications or patent filings since 2018, but they don't quite make it onto the top filing list. I think what's quite interesting about the Yili Group and the Bright Dairy itself is that they both have interest in New Zealand. They've got some collaborations and partnerships here. Westland Dairy was bought out by Yili Group by something like, I think it was 600 million New Zealand dollars, and Bright Dairy invested in Synlait, and I think it was about $80 million. So they've got commercial interests here in New Zealand. They both collaborate with Ag Research, as you can see on their website. And I had a quick look. I couldn't see that there was any recent patent filings or any patent filings really that there were co-applicants with Ag Research, but it'll be definitely interesting to see if these two Chinese companies start to collaborate more and file patents together for commercial opportunities. So this is kind of, you might be thinking, well, China's got all these patent filings, what are they actually covering? This is kind of a neat way of looking at it. So it basically takes all their patents. I've filtered it down somewhat compared to the previous couple slides, but it shows what China is focusing their attention on in the dairy space. So basically, if you've ever seen one of these before, a landscape map shows like you've got the hills, which represents areas where there's lots of patents. And then you've got the troughs or the valleys where there's very little patent filings. And then what I've overlaid it with is the top 5 Chinese companies in terms of their patent filings, and colored them and then laid them on top of the landscape. I didn't do that myself. It's all automated, thankfully. But you can kind of see from here that in terms of the Chinese companies, they're kind of focusing their attention on infant formulas that you can see, infant formulas and oligosaccharides, which you can see in the front left. You can see soy-based milks in the back area towards the left. To the left is quite an area of interest. Milks with probiotics, which I think is in the back right or along the back, and then concentrated milks in the middle section. And Yeely Group, which is the top filer, seems to have a fairly even spread across those different technologies. And if anyone's interested, actually, you can actually drill down into specific areas. So you can select parts of the map and go, I'm really interested in what the companies are doing in this particular space. And then you can generate reports and look at the patents specifically that you're interested in. So turning now to plant-based milks, what's actually happening in China versus outside China? And what I really wanted to do is dig down into the data and see what are the key plant materials that are being used, which kind of gives us a little bit of consumer insights into what type of milks might be attractive in China. And what was quite interesting to see here, I was expecting soy to kind of come up as #1, but interestingly, beans and rice kind of came up as the top hits from the last couple of years in Chinese patents. Whereas outside China, it was rice and soy, which were the top hits. And I think looking at the data, it was probably influenced largely by some of the other large company filers in Japan and South Korea that might be contributing to that. I couldn't help myself. I did a bit of a search for how often we see kiwi fruit in this landscape. And I actually found there was about 15 patents that they were all in China. That related to milk-based products that included kiwi fruit. So, it's these types of, refining of the data and looking at it, you can start to see whether or not there might be opportunity for companies in New Zealand that are particularly interested in kiwi fruit or other additives that could have application in dairy. In New Zealand, for example, we don't tend to, make milks that have kiwi fruit in them. But, in other countries in like China, they might be more open to those types of blends and so forth. Turning now to milk hybrids or hybrid milks, whatever you want to call it. This was a lot less common in the patent landscape from what I could tell and the refinement that we did. I think what was most interesting is that the examples that we did find all came from within China. And I think it probably just explains or helps to perhaps provide some confidence that these milk hybrids seem to be, consumer friendly. They seem to be open to these types of innovations within China. It seems like a lot of them, from what I could tell, at least from these examples, seem to be related to infant nutrition. But there's that top one there that's actually granted in China, which is a post-exercise functional beverage, and it's really focused on a blend of soy, wheat, and dairy proteins for optimal nutrition post-exercise, and it's all about the ratios of amino acids in the composition. It's actually bizarrely somewhat similar to the HVN project, which I happen to be involved with, called Multi-Promo, that some of you might remember, looking at kind of similar outcomes as well. So I think those types of things can be really interesting to look at from the Chinese market. And some of those other ones, I'm not going to go through them in any detail, but some of them are focused on flavor profiles, some of them are focused on high fiber, and some of them are focused on stability. So these patents aren't specifically focused all towards nutrition. There's other aspects that they're trying to solve for here. And probably just another thing to mention, some of you might be aware, I was actually innovation manager at Goodman Fielder before coming to Spruson Ferguson. And certainly from the consumer insights that we were seeing, that we were provided, you definitely did start to see some of these milk hybrids coming through on the market. They're obviously a relatively small proportion of the market space at the moment, but they're definitely starting to come through. So looking at some of the startups and what they're doing, from what I can tell, it's all about fermentation technology and alternative approaches to dairy, and this isn't a a complete list. Obviously, there are just some of the companies that came up in our search that we found particularly interesting. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of Maruku, who recently launched in New Zealand. It is probably quite unique in the sense that it's based on what's been disclosed so far. It's using plants that overexpress dairy or other proteins in these, and that instead of being, overexpressed in large fermentation tanks, it's using the power of plants to produce these types of proteins. And you'll see that they actually just recently filed a patent application in Australia, it looks like. New Culture uses microorganisms in fermentation tanks to produce casein. At this stage, their commercial target appears to be cheese. There's another company based in Germany, which previously was called Legendary Foods, now called Formo, and it utilizes similar fermentation technology to New Culture. And then the other one that probably a lot of you are aware of is the Turtle Tree, based in Singapore. I think they've just recently established themselves in the US, in California, and is focused on using animal-derived cells to produce real protein in culture. Previously, I remember looking at this company, and it was very focused on infant nutrition, but it seems that they're expanding out to more generic alternative dairy proteins for other uses. So it'll be really interesting to see how they are progressing. So kind of moving now towards the big multinationals and what they're doing. Again, this is just a bit of a snapshot. It's not everything, but here are some of the recent patents that they've filed in the last couple of years. I think what's really interesting, what I took from this is that, I guess historically they've been very focused on infant nutrition, but some of the recent patent filings are now focused on plant-based alternatives. And there's actually a couple on this list. The titles are method of producing milk-like proteins, or milk-like products, sorry. There's two of them there in particular. And when I dug down and had a look at those, they're actually patents that are towards stem cell-based process to produce mammalian milk. So they're getting into that cell-based milk production as well. It's not just the startups. Another one that's quite interesting here is serpin production. I was like, what's that all that about? It's quite different to their other titles. That is actually using human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs, to increase serpin production in bifidobacterium to help colonize the gut with beneficial microbes. So there seems to be a lot of, particularly in conventional dairy space, there seems to be a real focus towards the gut health is in particular, but less of a focus, I suppose, at this stage with the plant-based and milk hybrids and cell-based stuff. They're more focused around actually producing a good replica and efficiencies and so forth. Just quickly on Yili Group, I'm not going to go through this in any detail. Oh, I should just point out those words down at the bottom, that's actually extracted from a automated word cloud that you can look at a really wide scale over a company's patent portfolio. And I've just extracted here the kind of top 4 or 5 words that came out of that word cloud. So I butchered it a little bit, but I just wanted to make it a little bit more simple for you to look at. Yili Group, they're still very much focused on infant nutrition, and the key thing that they're looking at is HMOs, or human milk oligosaccharides, probiotics, and very much targeting gut health. It was quite interesting to see Staphylococcus show up in their word cloud here, and I was like, what's all that about? I thought it was a skin infection type thing. But looking down at there were 5 patents that mentioned Staphylococcus, and looking down on it, I didn't know this, but it can cause food poisoning. And so what they're developing is a composition which includes different strains of lactobacillus and human milk oligosaccharides to prevent staph infection, improve innate immunity, and also anti-aging. So there you go. I might look at that soon for myself. But yeah, I thought it was quite interesting to just see what Yili's doing in this space versus Nestle and so forth. And then very quickly, Perfect Day, as you might expect, very different in terms of their patent portfolio. Here's just a few of the more recent ones. It's all about recombinant milk production, or milk protein production, I should say, and very targeted towards that. I personally am very excited about this space because my background as in my PhD and so forth was around using molecular biology techniques to overexpress proteins recombinantly in different types of cells, and then purifying those for subsequent use. So I'd love to see these kind of conventional science techniques kind of blend in with food innovation. It's really exciting to see. So just to summarize before I pass over to Michelle, probably the 7 key lessons or opportunities I would say, well, I personally took for this, and I think that others can as well. Obviously, the dairy patent landscape is huge. It's dominated by Chinese filers. Even when I compared it to some of the recent reports I've done recently, it was roughly about 10 times the size of the plant bioactive report that I'd done recently. So I think, what does that mean? I think, there's obviously a lot of commercial opportunity. I think, but it's very crowded and it's very competitive. So yes, it does highlight there's lots of commercial opportunities, but at the flip side, you've got to be really conscious of freedom to operate and making sure you do your due diligence before you start your projects. And I think also looking at what's coming through in the space, there's huge potential for disruption in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years. Yes, Yili and Bright Dairy are the top patent filers. And as I mentioned before, both companies are of real interest locally. Nestle seems to be branching away from conventional dairy formula type patents and focused more on these new alternative milks. You've got beans and rice featuring predominantly in China in the plant-based milk. So it's just a reminder to remember. I'm moving a little bit away from the patent stuff and maybe treading into the consumer stuff here. Maybe I shouldn't be, but I think sometimes the patent landscape can give us indications of what's happening in the consumer space. So I think it's just a reminder to always think about the local palate and consumer acceptability locally. Landscape indicates that hybrid milks have acceptability in the Chinese market, and certainly that's my own experience. I've seen that starting to creep through more and more over the last couple of years. Startups focusing on the cell-based fermentation technology, and I think that in New Zealand we've got a great infrastructure to help these startups like Miruku coming through, and a great infrastructure to help that. And I think probably just as a last point, like you're seeing, a lot of these companies are using patents as an important strategic tool. So it's really important to consider, is it relevant for my business? In particular, a lot of these companies are using it less as a defensive tool and more as a value add to attract interest for future exit strategies. And I know from experience and previous work I've done that companies are always on the lookout for purchasing or licensing these new technologies and looking for collaboration opportunities. So definitely important to kind of keep that in mind when you're planning your innovation. All right, I will pass over to Michelle. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Peter. I'll just get my screen shared. Right, so yeah, following on from Peter's really good summary of what's happening with the patent landscape and a little bit around what's happening in terms of a few trends and things, the point of this part of the talk is to really go over some of the regulatory aspects, and also to look a little bit at how different considerations can shape what your commercialization strategy looks like. So as Mel said, I'm Michelle Cubitt. I'm a regulatory consultant. So today I will just very briefly touch a little bit on what's happening with a few changes to animal product regulations here in New Zealand, because it does have quite a significant impact in the dairy space. Just a couple of watch outs when it comes to sort of products in the infant and young children space. And then I'll go through several considerations that you can think about when you're looking at developing products or you're looking at innovating with ingredients in this space. So very, very briefly, we're just going through the process of a consolidation of regulations here in New Zealand for animal products. And of course, that does encompass dairy as well. So this is applicable whether you have a straight dairy-based milk or whether you are looking in the hybrid space as well. But essentially what's happened is we had a whole lot of different pieces of regulation, and now this is all being consolidated into one single regulation. So it's reducing the number of different notices, and it's reducing the number of different individual bits of regulation that have been added on as time's gone on in the animal product space. And there's now a much stronger focus on traceability and recall requirements throughout all of these regulations. So now, instead of having loads of different pieces of regulation to look at, there's two key sort of notices for this type of space. And it's been consolidated down to a notice that talks about production, supply and processing, and also another one to be really aware of. So the update hasn't quite come through for this yet, but it's a really key one to look at if you're looking at developing products in the infant and young children space. There's quite a bit to consider when you're looking at those sorts of products. So in terms of infant products and young children, I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics around the different regulations in this space today. Just know that there are a lot of strict controls. Obviously, this is an extremely vulnerable group. It's an extremely at-risk group, and hence with lots and lots of different things that have happened historically, there are now quite significant controls both here in New Zealand and internationally. And there's a lot of involvement with MPI here in New Zealand if you're looking at developing and exporting products in this space. And also it's important to know that there are a lot of registration requirements. So if you're looking to develop a product in this area, it's really important. Not only do you need to understand all the permissions around formulations and manufacturing, but also to be aware that sometimes that registration process can be significantly lengthy. And it's always good to understand exactly what the impact is on your ability to innovate in future as well. And so this is realistically for any product that especially is looking at having a dairy component, and it's for not just infants, which are under 12 months, but also young children. So that's those that are three and under as well. So just a flag to say, if you're going to look in this space, there's a lot of homework to do as part of a development project. But if we jump into overall considerations for different products in this space, there's quite a few key areas, but I've broken it down into these 5. So we'll go through all of them individually, but it's worth noting, of course, that regulations in each of these can be fairly similar, but also at the same time they can vary significantly between markets. So it's important to understand exactly what the regulations are here in New Zealand, because any product that is made here is expected to comply with our rules, and then also to understand exactly what all of those export market considerations are at the same time. So if we jump first into source material, the really key thing I think here is to understand exactly what is your source going to be. Are you going to have an animal source, or are you going to look more at a plant source? And what does that mean when it comes to actually formulating and manufacturing a product? If it is an animal material, there are quite a few considerations around which animal and all of the areas of how you get the milk, and then what you're going to do with it in terms of ongoing processing. With plants, a lot of it is around, is this known as a food ingredient source, or is it something that potentially is going to have a little bit more work because it's a bit more new in the food ingredient space? But a really, really big piece which informs a lot of compliance requirements is this piece around all these various limits. So whether it's contaminants, residues, toxins, and also micro limits as well. It's a really key space to understand how these can have a potential impact on that source material that you're using, because it can be that there are specific limits that you must reach at all times. And so knowing these early on in development makes it a lot easier to incorporate them as part of your final specification. And then from there, when you're starting to look at manufacturing, a really big one for anything in the dairy space is, of course, the RMP aspect. So that's the risk management program piece. It's a very specific requirement that is handled through MPI, and it's around understanding all of the risks in the manufacturing space when it comes to manufacturing dairy-based products, whether that's a solely dairy or whether it has a dairy component in it. You'll still need to look at manufacturing sites that can encompass this RMP requirement. Beyond that, in terms of the actual manufacturing methods used for your ingredient that you're developing or your product that you're developing, are these manufacturing methods really new, and do they have the potential to start raising questions around novel food considerations? So if you've got especially stuff in the cell technology space, this can quite often ask questions around, does it start to become novel, or is it still considered an okay as is food or food ingredient? Sometimes when you look at the fact that the final ingredient itself is still really much the same, and it's more just around it's been expressed from a different organism, it can come down to, is that organism something that can be found normally in nature, or are there some potential safety concerns that need to be addressed? And then beyond that as well, it's thinking about what kind of certification requirements are needed for that manufacturing facility as part of export, whether that's registration or whether that's part of an ongoing export program. It's good to understand exactly what those certification requirements are. So when you're looking at manufacturing partners, you're choosing ones that do also have the suitable certification for where you want to head. And then jumping into the actual formulation itself, it's really important to understand what is considered a dairy product and what isn't. So this is the MPI definition for here in New Zealand. So this is the decision-making process that they use to understand whether it is something that is going to be considered a dairy product by them, and then thus has all of the specific dairy regulation pieces come into it. And it's not just a case of being more than 50% dairy as well. It can also just be around exactly how that product is being presented and whether that dairy component is a characterizing ingredient. So that might mean that it's less than 50%, but because it's basically what the product is being leveraged on, it's how it's, it's on the front of the label, it's very clearly called out as part of the sort of target marketing for that product, then again, that can also mean that actually it can be considered a dairy product, regardless of the fact that it may only be at a smaller percentage. So it's important to sort of look at this when you're looking at hybrid milks as well. So yeah, despite the fact that it's not just dairy, it still will fall into having all of the standard dairy regulation requirements as well as the same as if it would be if it was like 100% animal milk. And then another piece to look at as well is food standards. So especially in the dairy space, there can be a range of food standards. And so what these are doing is these are sort of outlining the minimum requirements for something to be called a particular type of food. So in the dairy space, there'll be food standards generally for milk, cheese, yogurt, quite often there is for ice cream as well. And so it's understanding what the composition requirements are for those food standards and how that impacts your formulation. So are you permitted under that food standard to be able to add other ingredients, or are there certain restrictions in place? And also what can happen to product naming. So a good example of this is that if you're going to call something a milk, but it does contain either other plant-based ingredients as well as dairy, or it is solely plant-based, it can be around how that word milk is used. And quite often the expectation is that there's additional wording on the front of the label to clarify that it's not just straight milk. So if you're a hybrid, it would be a case of, you know, it's milk plus whatever your plant alternative is. And if you're looking at plant milks, it's more along the lines of specifying, you know, this is soy milk or this is oat milk, that kind of thing. And a really interesting space for dairy and for hybrids and the like as well is looking at what you can do around different claims. And obviously a really common one that comes into play in this space is calcium. And there's several different ways that you can access claims in this space. So we're using calcium as an example, but it's something that can be used for a range of different nutrients. So it's around looking at what are your options, even if you just want to talk about the fact that there's calcium in the formulation, versus if you want to go to the next stage and start really communicating those health benefits that come along with calcium. Some markets will allow a really high level of claim in this kind of space, but it will be on the basis of things where it's extremely well researched, such as calcium and obviously bone density and osteoporosis. But when you're looking at other components, so maybe you are looking at oligosaccharides, or maybe you are looking at other nutrients in this area, that may not necessarily be the same. You might be just limited to a content claim where it says, you know, this is in the product, and there might be quite a bit more clinical research that's required to then go and access through some of these general level health claims that you can get. And then again, how can that play out to the whole ingredient or the whole product itself? So whether you're zeroing in on a particular nutrient, or whether you want to try and look at something that is based on an entire ingredient instead, it's really good to understand the minimum levels and how these vary between markets, and then also what these health claim authorization processes look like. So is it one where you can self-substantiate, or is it one that requires a formal approval before you can access a health claim? And then the last little piece that comes in with all of this, of course, is the market access element to it. So you've managed to develop a product, or you managed to develop an ingredient for others to use in a product. But at the same time, there's always the issue around market access and how you can actually get that from here in New Zealand over to your target markets. Now, when it comes to anything with a dairy component to it, quite often there will be what's called an official assurance or a health certificate. So this is something that will be issued through MPI, and this is how it links back to that risk management program, that RMP piece for manufacturing facilities. So you'll get an official stamp from MPI, which then allows export into particular markets. But at the same time, there's quite a few checks and balances that MPI require in order to be able to issue that assurance. So understanding what that process looks like before you are ready to export is quite critical. And it's really important to engage someone in this space who's got quite a good understanding of MPI requirements, and then also the local market import requirements at the same time, so the two can match up to each other. Another piece as well is to always look at what the labelling requirements are, or whether there's any exemptions that you can have. So if you've got a product here in New Zealand, ideally it needs to comply with all of our labelling requirements as well as the export market requirements. Now, there are differences between our rules and overseas market rules, and you can work with MPI to be granted exemptions for this. They do have sort of standing exemptions, especially around nutrition information, because quite often that format varies between markets. But it's important to understand, are there any additional exemptions that you might need to seek from MPI as part of this? And as with any food product, definitely always register as an exporter. So whether that's yourself or whether you're working with a manufacturing partner and they're doing it on your behalf. And then, yeah, understanding those import requirements is really key, especially to understand, is there a registration process, or is it as simple as just a standard food import? So generally speaking, those import requirements will link back to that official assurance piece. So understanding what those timeframes look like to issue those certificates so that you're not caught with product already overseas and lacking in some of those certificate requirements as well. And then lastly, just especially with alternatives and hybrids, the really, really key pieces, of course, are novel food regulation, making sure there is history of safe consumption, using qualifiers and product naming, so soy milk and the like. For claims, recognise those nutrients that you can get an existing claim for, and then look at food standards and how that all comes together to whether it's a milk or some other type of beverage. And that's me.
Thank you both, Michelle and Peter. This is a particularly complex area, and I think, as you said, Michelle, because there's some history there, which has unfortunately kind of shaken a few things up, and we do seem to have an awful lot of regulation around this, and even more so in the infant space. So although there's some really wonderful kind of tips, which we're always thankful for, I think the overriding message is always get case-by-case advice from experts and whatever your plans are and what you're looking to develop. So we have a couple of experts here, and I'm sure there's a number of more of them out there as well. Probably going to be in high demand, I should think. So we're running a little bit over time, but we do have one question that I've seen has come in, and this is for Peter. In the hybrid space, is anyone looking at plant plus plant? I'm thinking of the old idea of legumes and cereals to get amino acid complementarity.
Yeah, great question, Simon. So I think that one case that I mentioned about one of the Chinese patent that had granted, that definitely had a combination of wheat and soy. Obviously, there was dairy in there too, but I think the purpose was to try and get amino acid complementarity. And another trend that I did see is with the Chinese, when we were looking at the plant-based milks and the Chinese landscape, there was definitely a lot of cases where there was multiple plant material in there. I didn't get down to the level of detail as to whether or not dairy was included, but it certainly seems that combinations are being seen. And another one that just came up that I haven't seen it in the patent landscape, but there's a company in South America called Notco, and they've just launched a product called Not Milk, which is interesting from a regs point of view. But they've got they use AI technology to try and mimic real milk, and they've got like a plethora of different plant material in there. You know, they've got all the regulars. They can have 20, 30 different type of plant materials, including, I've even seen pineapple and cabbage in there. So they really go to town in terms of really trying to mimic that milk taste and potentially also the nutritional benefit and amino acid profile. So yeah, definitely seeing that out there. I don't know if Michelle's got any comments about the naming perspective and whether or not milk would be considered to be an issue, considering there's no milk in it whatsoever, or if that's very clear to and there's no kind of misleading going on.
Yeah, that is a tricky one. It's been quite cheeky. You can see how they're trying to sort of play around with making it clear that it's not, but I would say it probably is reasonably okay. They'll probably get a couple of issues if they were trying to go over to Europe, or potentially even in Canada a little bit. They seem to be a little bit more protective of those sort of food standard namings, but most other places, I think, yeah, there's probably scope for cool names like that.
Doesn't necessarily tell the consumer what it is, though, does it?
No, I think there might need to be a subline potentially in some markets which sort of has a bit more of a boring blanket. This is a, you know, plant-based milk of some kind.
Thank you. There's another question from Simon. Thank you, Simon, and kia ora. So for Michelle, for materials derived by precision fermentation, are you indicating that the regulator is focused on the source, e.g. cow versus microbe, rather than the actual material, e.g. nature identical casein?
Yeah, so I think in those sorts of instances, if you've got the final product itself is still identical to something that you will find in nature, they probably are going to ask more questions on how it came about. So yeah, whether it's an animal or whether it's a microbe. Certainly they've looked at this a bit in the human oligosaccharide space, where there's been quite a bit of conversation around, yes, that final oligosaccharide still mimics the one that's found in nature, but there's the question around, does that fermentation technique and that specific organism, including if it's a genetically engineered organism, does that have the potential to add something else or change something else, and how that impacts that final oligosaccharide as well. But a lot of it does seem to come down to how is that manufacturing process still creating something that's identical and something that's going to have, you know, the same performance when someone consumes it.
Thanks, Michelle and Peter. I can't see any further questions coming. Did anyone want to take the mic and ask a question, or can we wind up for today? No, okay, we're a little bit over time, so sorry to keep you, but it is such an interesting subject, and as you can see, it really is the sort of thing we can probably talk about a lot longer. So I hope today has given you a bit of an overview of these areas, both from the patent landscape perspective and the regulatory considerations. And if you would like to listen to this webinar again or see any of our other hot topics, please visit the HVN Nutrition, High Value Nutrition National Science Challenge website, where they are posted. We will have a range of further webinars coming, and please keep an eye on the Riddet Institute website and our LinkedIn, where we will post details of these in due course. So other than that, thank you again for all of you to join us, and of course Peter and Michelle for bringing your expertise, and wishing everybody a great day. See you all again next time. Ka kite anō.